Maria sat alone in a plastic chair getting her third round of chemotherapy, watching the clear liquid drip slowly into her arm, and realized something that broke her heart more than the diagnosis itself had. 6 months earlier, her phone never stopped buzzing with friends checking in, coworkers dropping off meals, her own sister calling every single day. But cancer, she was learning, has a way of scattering people the longer it drags on. The calls became texts. The texts became silence. Even her sister, overwhelmed with her own life, had stopped answering as often as she used to. Maria sat in that chair, completely alone, tears sliding down her face, and whispered into the sterile hospital air, "Does anybody even remember I'm still here?" She says she wasn't expecting an answer. But what happened over the next several weeks convinced her, without a single doubt, that someone had been listening the entire time. This is Maria's story. Maria was 39 years old, a single mother raising 2 kids on her own, when a routine checkup turned into the diagnosis that would upend her entire world. Stage 3 breast cancer. The words landed like a physical blow, and in the disorienting weeks that followed, she found herself thrown into a world of appointments, treatments, and decisions she never imagined having to make, all while still trying to be a steady presence for her 9-year-old and 11-year-old. At first, the support poured in exactly the way she'd hoped it would. Friends organized meal trains. Her sister flew in for the first surgery. Her small group from church sent cards and prayed over her before every appointment. For a while, despite the fear, Maria felt surrounded, carried by a community determined not to let her walk through this alone. But cancer, she learned, is a marathon most people aren't prepared to run alongside someone for. The meal trains slowed after 2 months. The cards stopped coming. Her small group, well-meaning as they were, quietly stopped checking in as their own lives filled back up with the ordinary busyness that hers no longer had room for. Her sister, dealing with her own struggles at home, started calling once a week instead of every day, then once every few weeks. Maria understood, in theory. She knew people weren't being cruel. Life moves forward, even when yours has been forced to stop. But understanding it didn't make the loneliness hurt any less. There were nights she sat on her bathroom floor after her kids had fallen asleep, too exhausted and nauseous from treatment to even cry properly, wondering how she had become invisible to so many people so quickly. The chemotherapy sessions became the loneliest hours of her week. In the beginning, someone always sat with her. By round 3, she was going alone, sitting in a chair surrounded by other patients who each had someone by their side, while she scrolled through a phone that had gone eerily quiet. That particular day, watching the chemo drip slowly into her arm, surrounded by people yet entirely alone, something inside her simply broke. She whispered that question into the sterile air, not really expecting an answer, just needing to say it out loud to someone, even if that someone was only God. Maria had grown up with faith, the kind woven into the fabric of her childhood. But the exhaustion and isolation of the past several months had worn her connection to God thin, much like it had worn thin her connection to nearly everyone else. She still believed, but her prayers had become short, tired requests muttered before falling asleep, more habit than heartfelt conversation. That day in the chemo chair, though, something different rose up in her. Not a polished prayer. Not even really words at first. Just tears, and a raw, honest cry from somewhere deep inside her chest. God, I don't understand why everyone left. I know they have their own lives. I know I can't blame them, but I feel so alone right now, and I don't know how much more of this I can carry by myself. If nobody else is going to show up for me anymore, I need you to. I need to know you're still here because right now, I don't feel anything at all. She sat with that prayer for a long time, watching the drip continue, feeling emptied out in a way she hadn't allowed herself to feel in months. She didn't feel a sudden peace wash over her the way she'd hoped. She just felt tired and honest and small. But she says something about speaking that prayer out loud, even in a whisper, even through tears in a room full of strangers, cracked something open in her that had been sealed shut for weeks. A tiny, stubborn thread of hope she didn't even know was still there. The very next morning, Maria's phone rang. It was a woman named Denise, someone from her church small group Maria barely knew, someone who had never reached out personally before, someone Maria wasn't even sure had her number. Denise explained, a little hesitantly, that she'd woken up that morning with Maria heavy on her heart and mind, an unshakable feeling she couldn't quite explain. and she felt like she needed to call and ask how Maria was really doing. Not the polite version, the real one. Maria broke down on the phone, the loneliness of the past months finally spilling out to someone willing to listen. Denise listened without interrupting, and when Maria finished, Denise said something that stayed with her. "I don't know why God put you on my heart so strongly this morning, but I think he's telling me you're not supposed to be doing this alone anymore." Denise showed up the next day with coffee. She sat with Maria through her next chemo appointment and the one after that. She started a new group text, quietly reorganizing the meal train, and this time, something was different. It didn't fade after 2 months. Denise made sure of it. She recruited 2 other women from the church, women Maria barely knew, who began rotating through, sitting with her during treatments, picking her kids up from school on hard days, showing up in the ordinary, practical ways that Maria had quietly stopped believing anyone still would. Maria says what struck her most wasn't just that help arrived. It was the timing of it. Denise had never once called her personally in the entire time Maria had been sick, not during surgery, not during the first rounds of treatment. And then, the very morning after Maria's most honest, desperate prayer, sitting alone in that chemo chair, Denise's phone call came out of nowhere, carrying exactly the message Maria needed to hear. "I know Denise would say it was just a feeling she had," Maria says. "But I believe it was more than that. I believe that was God answering me, using someone else's hands and voice to do it. Less than 24 hours after I asked him if anyone even remembered I was still here." Maria completed her treatment 8 months later. Her scans came back clear, and she's now over a year into remission, watching her kids grow, slowly rebuilding a life that cancer had interrupted but ultimately couldn't take from her. But she says the real transformation of that season wasn't just physical healing. It was learning, in the loneliest chapter of her life, that God doesn't always answer prayers with a lightning bolt or a sudden, overwhelming peace. Sometimes he answers through a phone call from someone you barely know, at the exact moment you need it most. Carrying a love and faithfulness you'd started to believe you'd lost access to completely, Maria and Denise remain close friends today. Maria has since joined that same small group herself, and she's become the one who now notices when someone quietly starts to disappear, the one who reaches out first, who shows up with coffee and no agenda other than simply being present. "I used to think being abandoned by so many people meant God had forgotten me too," Maria says. "Now I understand it completely differently. Sometimes people walk away not because God has stopped caring, but because he's making room for the people he actually sent to carry you through. I just had to be honest enough to admit I couldn't do it alone before I could see them coming." Maybe you're watching this today, and you know exactly what it feels like to be surrounded by people yet still feel completely alone. Maybe you've watched friends slowly drift away during your hardest season, watched the calls and check-ins fade, and found yourself wondering, in your own version of that chemo chair, if anyone even remembers you're still fighting. Maria's story is a tender reminder that even when everyone else walks away, Jesus never does. He may not always show up the way we expect, with dramatic, undeniable signs. Sometimes he shows up through an unexpected phone call, a stranger who becomes a friend, a small, quiet nudge in someone else's heart that leads them straight to your door at exactly the moment you need them most. If you're in a lonely season right now, don't be afraid to say the honest prayer Maria said. Tell God exactly how alone you feel. Ask him to show up, even if you don't know what that will look like. And then stay open to the ways he might answer, because sometimes the miracle isn't a moment. Sometimes it's a person sent right on time, carrying exactly what your heart has been aching for. You are not forgotten. You are not invisible. Even in the emptiest chair, in the quietest room, in the loneliest season of your life, Jesus is closer than you think, and he is already working to send you exactly what you need.